All right, today we're going to take a look at two very closely related concepts, tone and connotation, or emotionally loaded language. Tone is an author's attitude towards its subject, and an author's attitude towards their subject is really going to be expressed through the words they choose. So the more emotionally loaded the words are, or the more connotation the words have, the better sense we are going to have of an author's tone towards their subject. So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down both of these terms individually, and then we'll talk a little bit of how they interact and relate to one another. So, as I mentioned, tone is the writer's attitude towards his or her subject. And the tone can take all sorts of different emotions. It can be playful or intimate, serious, baffled, angry, depressed, or outraged. What's going to determine the tone that the author has towards their subject is really the words that they're choosing to use to describe the subject. So it's important that we try to recognize the tone while we read, and this is really important in all aspects of life, whether we're reading a novel, a short story, or even a friend's text message. What we'll find is it's not too uncommon for people to misread a text message. They'll interpret the message that maybe was meant as a joke or meant to be taken seriously, and someone misinterprets it in a way that becomes offensive. I think many of us have found ourselves in situations where this has happened. Well, the consequences in misinterpreting the tone of a essay or a novel might not be as significant as misinterpreting the tone of a text message. It nonetheless is important in truly understanding a work. So let's take a look at an example. Think about how the tone is built throughout the course of this short passage. The girls were playing in the pond, splashing each other and trying to catch fish with their hands. They were having fun, but kept looking over their shoulders at the looming forest. The long grass of the field kept moving, and they sort of felt like they were being watched. About a half hour passed, and still the girls kept checking the fields for movement. It seemed like a pair of dark eyes was on them. They even considered going back inside, but that would mean homework time. So they continued splashing, but with caution now. Their eyes hardly left the field. You can see that the author has gone through great lengths to create a sense of suspense, and maybe even danger lurking in the forest. We can see words like looming and dark eyes. These help create this very kind of foreboding tone. Let's move on and see the rest of the passage and see how things shape out. Finally, one of the girls pointed to the grass and giggled. Meow. A cat sat on the edge of the field and licked its paws. They did indeed have company. The girls ran over to the cat and pet his belly. They laughed, and the cat sauntered back to the field. Well, as you guys can see, the tone dramatically changed. There's a few factors that have led to this change. One, we find out that the dark-eyed danger that was lurking in the woods is nothing more than a cat. But then we also see some other words here that help break that tension. Words like giggled and sauntered back to the field. And even what the girls do, they run over and they pet the cat's belly. These all work to change the tone in a significant way. While this passage started off being suspenseful and full of danger, it gives way to this light-hearted, kind of fun finish. Now, what we find is that authors can use tone to persuade an audience. The most reasonable arguments that an author can make is to use statistics, facts, and expert opinion. This often portrays a very reasonable and neutral tone. And one thing that a tone like this is often criticized for is it doesn't really grasp and grab the audience's attention. So an author on a reasonable or rational tone is often considered to be the most credible, but it just doesn't really bring or hook the reader's attention to what the author is trying to get across. So as a result, the author is really left to try to figure out, well, what are some ways that I can grab my reader's attention? Emotionally loaded language, or words with strong connotation, is one way to do it. So sometimes when authors want to persuade the reader, they use emotionally loaded language, which include both negative and positive words, or words with both positive and negative connotation. So words have both denotation and connotation. Denotation is the strict dictionary definition of a word. If you open up the dictionary and you look up the definition for, say, um, lurking, it's going to give you a definition that kind of talks about something creeping in the background or kind of sneaking around. Uh, but this word also has connotation. There's an emotion that's associated with the word lurking, lurking in the dark. The ideas and meanings suggested by an associated with a word or the connotation can both be positive and negative. So a word like lurking has a fairly negative connotation. It gives us a feeling that we're being spied on or having our space violated. So this is very different than the dictionary connotation. While they're interrelated, they're related to one another, they both serve a different function. So let's take a look at some examples. We look at the two sentences here on the screen. You look different today, or you look weird today. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone having these sentences said to them. If you're in the hall and you just get to school and your friend says, "You look different today," you may actually take a moment and think like, okay, well, what does look different about me today? You might even look, am I wearing something new? Did I have my hair parted in a different way? What is different about me? There's nothing negative about that word. It's more neutral. And I don't think that you would really be offended if someone said that to you. You would simply be kind of searching for, well, why do I look different? Now, if that same person came up to you and said, "You look weird today," you may have a different reaction. You may immediately be offended. You may ask yourself, well, what looks weird? The word weird has a negative connotation. That means whatever looks different about you looks wrong or bad to whoever is saying this to you. So we have some more examples. Let's say your friend goes to Valley Fair and they come back and they say, "Oh, we bought some inexpensive souvenirs at Valley Fair." Your initial thought might be, well, inexpensive, but you might not have a judgment about what it actually is that they purchased. However, if they say we bought cheap souvenirs at Valley Fair, that implies something completely different. It implies not only was the souvenir inexpensive, but it also implies that the souvenir very well might be poorly made. So again, cheap has a negative connotation, whereas inexpensive is a fairly neutral connotation. Has a neutral connotation. Another example. The sophomore's behavior can best be described as youthful, as opposed to the sophomore's behavior can be described as immature. Again, the sentences are more or less the same with the exception of the last word. Youthful and immature carry two different connotations. Youthful is fairly positive. It gives you a sense of playfulness, of kind of fun and lighthearted, whereas immature has a connotation of being disrespectful and behaving in a way that's well below how old you are. All right, last one. You may live in a house, but we live in a home. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the difference between house and home? When we think of the word house, we think of the actual structure that we live in. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, the roof over our head. It is a very neutral word. But when we start thinking about the word home, it has an entirely different meaning, a very positive connotation. It's emotionally loaded. When we think about home, we don't think just about the walls and the roof. We think about the pictures on the wall. We think about the people who live in the home. We think about family dinners. And we think about how we interact with each other under that roof. We build a home, whereas we simply live in a house. I think I got that wrong. We build a house, but we live in a home. So let's take a look at this next passage. I'll read it out loud, and we want to try to determine which words have positive and negative connotations. The warm, bright spring had finally arrived. I got in the passenger seat of my brother's car. He got in the driver's seat. We rolled down the windows, and he popped a CD in the stereo, turned up the volume, and headed out for the lake. This is a recipe for a great feeling and harmless fun, right? Some uptight state senators don't think so. They have proposed a ridiculous law that outlaws car speakers above a certain size and sets legal volume levels coming from car stereos. This insane law is misguided and unfair to us innocent, fun-loving youth. These music Nazis must be stopped. Well, you can see that this passage is full of words with both positive and negative connotations. In fact, in about the middle of the passage, it shifts from positive words to negative words. So let's take a closer look at this. You can see that the green words have positive connotations while the red words have negative connotations. Words like warm, bright spring, great feeling, and harmless fun all give us a sense of freedom, of a good feeling, and fun time. Whereas the red words, uptight, ridiculous, outlaws, insane, misguided, unfair, and Nazis, all have very negative connotations. This passage is also interesting because we have this very clear marker of where the tone changes. When we look at that line that begins, "This is a recipe for a great feeling and harmless fun," right? The author throws in this rhetorical question, the word right, and it is at this moment that we see the significant shift in tone. Now, as you can see, I'm starting to use the tone quite a bit more now. Going back to the beginning of this presentation, when I said these two things, connotation and tone, are interrelated, this is evident right here. We can see that we have positive connotative words at the beginning and negative connotative words at the end. We can see that the tone shifts from being fun and lighthearted for the first half of the passage while being negative and judgmental in the second half of the passage. In fact, it's interesting, this passage even uses a word that has one of the strongest connotations of them all, Nazis. So let's take a closer look at this word. Oh, I'm sorry, that's on the next slide. So we're going to take a moment and look at connotation and meaning. Words are associated with images and meaning. So when we take a word like apple, apples are associated with health. Apple a day keeps the doctor away. It's also associated with New York City, the Big Apple. It's also associated with temptation, Adam and Eve. What word carries the most powerful association in the previous slide? And unfortunately, I mentioned this already. Nazis quite obviously carries the most connotation out of all these words. So let's take a quick look at that. So when we look at the denotation, the dictionary definition, a Nazi is a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, founded in Germany in 1919 and brought to power in 1933 under Adolf Hitler. Now, that word it's a very historical definition of what a Nazi is. It's a classification of a person. It's someone who has membership in a particular political party. But Nazi also has connotation. There's a significant emotion that's associated with it. It's not just the National Socialist German Workers' Party that we think of. We think of the Holocaust. We think of brutality, genocide, death, torture, war, world conquest. Now, is the state senator who wants to pass this law truly a Nazi? Is that a fair word? Or is the connotation of the word Nazi a little bit harsh for the situation in which this author is using it? Now that brings us to the end of this slide, or this presentation. We've looked at both tone and connotation, and we've looked at how these two words, these two concepts are related to one another. When we read tomorrow we'll begin reading a lecture or a sermon by the author Jonathan Edwards. It's a sermon that was written in the late 1600s, and it's a sermon that's full of fire and brimstone. It's a sermon that's warning the congregation of their imminent demise and likelihood of spending an eternity in hell. Edwards uses a fair amount of emotionally loaded language, and he has a very clear tone in his sermon. So, As we move throughout the course of the rest of this unit, we want you to pay close attention to what an author's attitude is towards their subject and what words they use to help portray that.